Welcome to History 101, Lecture 25, The First Globalization. By the effects of this relentless quest for new markets and new consumption items, and for raw materials to make those consumption items, quote, going from progress to progress, European civilization has now reached the negation of its own starting point. It aimed at dominating the world, and now the entire world turns ever more European. One might even say it's all Europe already. Yet this annexation of East by West scares many an historian and many an economist, who all wonder whether in that new world that is now all around us, Europe, with all its science and industry, will not suffer an inevitable decline. Once factories rise up in India, in the Caribbean, in Mexico or in Brazil, will those people not start working there for longer hours and lower wages than Europeans? Some indeed argue that the day may soon be upon us when the Europeans will not be able to hold on any longer in this economic struggle for survival. The Europeans may be eclipsed, nay, economically sentenced to death by the far more disciplined Chinese, in future perhaps by the Hindus, and maybe in the very long run even by Africans. These words are still very appropriate in 2016, but they were actually written by French geographer and prominent member of the French anarchist movement Elyse Reclus in 1898. So far from that, we are witnessing now an entirely new and historically unprecedented change, the process for which since the 90s the word globalization has become fashionable, has in fact been going on for a very long time already. It was merely known by different names. As we saw in the 18th century, Thomas Colonial already argued that all parts of the world now so closely consociated with one another that no one was isolated anymore. Nonetheless, people in the late 19th century were to an extent right if they had the idea they were witnessing an unprecedented change and the dawning of a new age that John Maynard Keynes, in retrospect, classically described in 1920, quote, "What an extraordinary episode in the economic progress of man that age was, which came to an end in August 1914. The inhabitant of London could order by phone, sipping his morning tea in bed, the various products of the whole earth, in such quantity as he might see fit, and reasonably expect their early delivery upon his doorstep. He could at the same moment, and by the same means, adventure his wealth in the natural resources and new enterprises in any quarter of the world, and share, without exertion or even trouble, in their prospective fruit and advantages. And he regarded this state of affairs as normal, certain and permanent, except in the direction of further improvement. The projects and policies of militarism and imperialism, of racial and cultural rivalries, of monopolies, of restrictions and of exclusion, which were to play the serpent to this paradise, were little more than the amusement of his daily newspaper, and appeared to exercise almost no influence at all on the ordinary course of social and economic life, the internationalisation of which was nearly complete in practice. Keynes obviously used the word internationalisation in the precise sense as globalization is used nowadays. For, had Marx and Engels already predicted in the Communist Manifesto in 1848, quote, the need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the entire surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. The bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. In place of the old ones, satisfied by production of the country, we find new ones, requiring for their satisfaction the products of distant lands and climes. In place of the old local and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, the universal interdependence of nations, and as in material, so also in intellectual production. The intellectual creations of individual nations become common property, and from the numerous national and local literatures there arises a world literature. So that because of the increasing worldwide organization of trade and production, many thought states had already lost their relevance or soon would. The Austrian lawyer Karl Thomas Richter argued in 1901, for example, that countries and peoples in economic terms are increasingly disappearing. The individual industrial regions are pursuing one and the same goal in increasingly similar ways. While the British historian James Bryce noted optimistically that by world trade a new form of human unity has been created. Many assumed as well that because of all these close economic ties amongst each other, countries could not and would not afford to wage war against each other any longer. Most famously, Norman Angell's 1909 bestseller The Great Illusion, a book which ultimately was to get him the Nobel Prize for Peace. This is actually an habitually misunderstood book. It is ritually quoted by so-called realists in international relation theory to make their case that close trade relations, or indeed a liberal democratic order, do not change one iota in the harsh realities of power politics, witnessing all the idle hopes of such forlorn idealists as Angell, who is said to have predicted that war was impossible in a liberal world order. Yet this was actually not at all what Angell argued. He rather reasoned that war between Britain and Germany, both liberal democracies as they might be, was very likely in the very near future, but that it was as yet not unavoidable. And he warned that lest those two governments were starkly and ragingly mad, they could not allow a major war, lest both their own and the entire integrated global system would disintegrate, and that would ensue in decades of economic crises, of revolutions and further wars. During his long life, from 1872 to 1967, Angell could experience all that, and the threat of a nuclear war in addition, and yet he had proven a true Cassandra. Angell's, Richter's and Bryce's view was shared by, as I said, the leading theoretician of the social democratic movement, Karl Kautsky. In July 1914, as press and public were awaiting the reactions of the Austrian government on the murder of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, he penned an article in which he wrote that, quote, "What Marx said of capitalism can also be applied to imperialism. Monopoly creates competition, and competition creates monopoly. So the ultimate result of a world war between the great imperialist powers may be a federation of the strongest, who renounce their arms race. Hence, from the purely economic standpoint, it is not impossible that capitalism may still jive through another phase. The translation of monopoly into foreign policy, a phase of ultra-imperialism, which of course we must struggle against, but whose perils lay in another direction, not in that of an arms race and the threat to world peace. Because of the singularly bad timing of Kautsky's publication, events itself appear to have contradicted his prediction within a few days. Yet they may ultimately have proven nearly clairvoyant, seen from the very long perspective of the so-called international community of the 21st century. And all this was due as much to the opening of such new markets as Nigeria, Equatoria, the Ivory Coast, as to the increasingly worldwide production and marketing of goods, such as the sewing machines that by 1900 were marketed worldwide, and which gave rise to a market for second-hand cloth from Amsterdam's Jewish quarter via Brazzaville to Yogyakarta in the Dutch East Indies that could be reworked by sewing machines, though admittedly the kind of clothes these places made were widely different. Whilst the uniforms of servants in both the colonial societies were the same white, as was the archetypical colonial wear, the pitch helmet, the short trousers with long stockings, or the white or khaki uniforms, there were still worlds of differences between Indonesian sarongs and panje dress for women in Brazzaville. Or take the bicycle, that too evolved to a commodity similarly marketed worldwide, yet adapted locally. As with the rickshaw and the cycle rickshaw, both invented in Japan in the 1880s, a kind of fusion between bicycle and palanquin. In Asia, it had the same role as the horse-drawn cab in Europe. Later, of course, in the 1980s, those bicycles were in turn replaced by scooters to form the modern motor rickshaw that is now the most common way of public conveyance in South Asia, in East Africa, in adapted form in the Philippines, and interestingly in parts of West Africa. Scooter rickshaws are common in northern Nigeria, but far less so in the south. So that far from anybody on earth now consumed exactly the same goods. They were always locally adapted and transformed, sometimes so much so as to be unrecognizable. Yet the flow of goods and of fashions in the age of Keynes' internationalization was still by and large one direction only, from industrialized to non-industrialized countries. For example, by 1880, shops in the Peruvian Andes had English tinned fish, French wine, English beer, shoes and boots from Italy, shoe polish from the USA, or French bicycles for sale. Yet shops in Paris or New York sold preciously little from the Andes. And Asia too had preciously little impact on the West, and very few goods from Asia were sold there, except for what was commonly called colonial commodities on the European continent that were sold in special colonial shops. Yet on Asia, those Western goods and the Western lifestyle coming with them had nearly existential impact, transforming the most elementary ways of life. Vietnamese writer Huy Tan, looking back on the 60 years of his life, formulated it in 1941 thus: "We live in French houses, we wear French hats, French shoes and French clothes. We use electricity and watches, we travel by train and we ride a bicycle. And all that in 60 years. Westernization has first changed form, then context. It will go through more forms. It has changed our way of life, our thoughts, our rhythm of life, our feelings. The West has penetrated into the very depths of our soul. We cannot be happy in the way we used to, be sad in the way we used to, hate as we used to, be angry in the same way as before." End quote. Western observers were by 1900 also struck by the degree to which modern cities increasingly began to resemble one another. That was partly intentionally, since indeed throughout the British Empire public buildings were erected to the tastes of the Institute for Arts and Crafts in South Kensington, nowadays the Victoria and Albert Museum. Or, as the anchor of British colonial life, the club and the officers' mess was everywhere built in exactly the same way, so as to make British expatriates feel at home everywhere. Or, as the French in all their colonies erected buildings so as to resemble southern France, and the Portuguese did to resemble Lisbon, so that Rio's main fashionable thoroughfare in the 19th century was a virtual copy of Lisbon Avenida da República, as was indeed the main avenue of Mozambique's new capital, Lourenco Marques, and obviously everywhere, but particularly in Latin America, for which in this period France was always the intellectual and artistic lodestar. Architects ogled Haussmann's rescheduling of Paris, so that such new 19th century metropolises as Montevideo, Santiago de Chile, and above all Buenos Aires all have a vaguely Parisian air to them, though they resemble no place in Paris in particular. And it was partly too, since utilitarian office blocks increasingly looked alike everywhere, so that office blocks along the Shanghai Bund, the center of the European neighborhood, could equally well stand in London, in Melbourne, in Chicago, in Alexandria, or in Buenos Aires. Though admittedly the slums immediately behind the Bund, and in which 3/4 of Shanghai's 2 million people huddled together, and where workers would have to sweat years merely to afford a windowless hut made of straw, could only be in China. But for those expatriates who stuck to expatriate companionship, as the 200,000 Westerners living in Shanghai virtually all did, Shanghai could indeed be anywhere. As another example, take that Dutch teacher who made a cycling tour through Java in the 20s of the 20th century and complained later on, in his account, he might just as well have stayed in the Netherlands, for he encountered everywhere the same old trusty road signs of the General Dutch Society for Cyclists, and any pension he stayed in could just as well have been in the Veluwe. Indeed, to him Java was now exactly like the Veluwe, except for the landscape, the language, the inhabitants, the animals, the plants, the stars or the skies then, that he had apparently studiously ignored or avoided. But then again, much of the present writings on globalization have, I suspect, also been written by people who have never ventured any further than the Hyatt Regency or Holiday Inn Hotel, in which of course the saying goes, it is Sunday, so this must be Paris. Its restaurant, where they have only feasted on hamburgers, have at night only switched on CNN, not watched any local TV, and have of course studiously avoided any contact with natives beyond a few journalists, bankers, the cab driver to and from the airport, and perhaps the lady of the local escort agency. So, as people increasingly thought borders were disappearing, the late 19th century featured a flurry of organizations with international in their name, starting perhaps with the International Red Cross, founded by Swiss banker Henri Dunant, that by 1900 was active, as the boys noted, in all European theatres of war. Or, to take another famous example, there was the International Olympic Committee, founded by French Baron Pierre de Coubertin in 1890. Or again, there was the first international motor rally from Peking to Paris, won by Italian Prince Borghese in 1907. All these were, as is apparent, very, very upper-class affairs, as indeed all participants in the first Olympic Games of 1898 were too. Yet if these were the upper classes at play, the proletarians of the Working Men Association were also international. And the Working Men Association held the, in retrospect, a rather bizarre idea that for the proletariat, national boundaries or distinctions were of no importance anymore, and that the only fatherland of the proletariat was the Workers' International. Now, that they had no fatherland was perfectly true for the uppermost layer of the upper classes, the equivalent of the modern corporate jet set. One might say the private train compartment set. That international aristocracy, who might spend the winter in, say, their villa in Biarritz, Cannes or Nice, the latter two have of course remained jet set hangouts until the present. They might spend the spring in, say, Carlsbad or Baden-Baden. The summer, obviously, they would spend in their apartment in Paris, and they might spend autumn in, say, going stag hunting in the Scottish Highlands or attending the London season. Those social occasions were by 1900 attended as well by a few daughters of the American super-rich, who braved the 3 weeks crossing across the Atlantic so as to enhance the standing of their family by snapping up some European aristocratic husband. So that, to mention but two famous examples, Jenny Jerome, daughter of Wall Street speculator Jeremy Jerome, became Lady Spencer Churchill, 7th Duchess of Marlborough. Other was Victoria Leiter, daughter of Levi Leiter of the retail chain Marshall Fields, nowadays called Macy's, who became Maria Victoria Curzon, Baron Curzon of Kettleston, Vice-Reine of India. Whereas by 1900 even a few Maharajas and a few Indian ultra-rich families, such as the ancient Khatri merchant house of Nehru from Delhi, who had originally acted as tax collectors to the Mughal Empire, could send their son, Jawaharlal, to boarding school in England. Yet all this was assuredly not true for the working classes, whose horizon extended no further than a few streets of a slum in, say, Salford, Bochum or Enschede, and who were commonly ferociously patriotic, if not chauvinistic. That was perhaps least so in Italy and Spain, where the working classes or the peasants still primarily identified themselves as Sicilians or as Basques, rather than as Italians or Spaniards. For to Sicilians, Rome merely meant taxes and conscription. However, in France, in England, even to an extent in Scotland, in the Netherlands and even in Germany, however new that entire nation was, there was surely an all-pervasive working-class patriotism, one in which even the most radical German social democratic activist would put next to his picture of his social democratic hero, Ferdinand Lassalle, either one of himself in reserve soldier uniform during the last military maneuver, or one of national hero Bismarck. To that extent, the idea of the social democrats that should countries ever go to war, the Social Democratic International would answer with a European-wide strike that would put an immediate end to all such folly, was from the outset stillborn, and particularly so for that almighty Sozialdemokratische Partei Deutschlands, on which one outside observer already noted, and indeed predicted in 1912, quote, "The German socialists would not desire the defeat of the German Empire. Their socialism is new in its absence of scruples. It guards vehemently the immediate interest of workers, but it is never ashamed to sacrifice any principle, and that's particularly so in foreign policy, to do so." This entire idea of a general strike was in retrospect perhaps as utopian as that other flourishing international movement of the late 19th and early 20th century, the international peace movement, a movement that by 1900 had 425 member societies with a good 100,000 members in 45 countries, and on whose behest in 1899 the first International Peace Conference solemnly convened in The Hague, presided over by that greatest partisan of international peace and understanding, namely His Imperial Majesty Tsar Nicholas II of all of Russia. At that conference, 45 countries, including all the great powers, equally solemnly pledged to henceforth peacefully settle international disputes by way of an international court that was to convene in The Hague. The powers further settled on such matters as that exploding ammunition should not be used in war. This is one convention all powers have actually respected, and they further settled that civilian ships and hospital ships could not be attacked during war at sea, a convention Germany ignored during the First World War, and which ultimately was a major reason for the USA's declaration of war. Surely, the nations were still spending fortunes on armaments, but nonetheless, one highly influential journalist and peace activist could argue that war between such civilized nations as Germany and Britain was now completely out of the question, and that independent judicial arbitration was now the way forward for civilized people. The day indeed was close when, as Tennyson had said, quote, "when the war drum throbs no longer, the battle flags are furled. In the Parliament of Man, the Federation of the World, war would be confined to uncivilized places." He was called William Stead and went down on the steamship Titanic in 1912, arguably more or less symptomatic for the entire peace movement, though it merits attention that the Latin American co-signatories to the Hague Convention have clung to it far more than European states did. Unlike European states, Latin American ones have resorted to international arbitrage in border conflicts, and while Latin American states fought myriad conflicts over boundaries in the 19th century, There has actually been only one interstate war there in the 20th century, the Chaco War between Bolivia and Paraguay from 1932 to 1935. Then again, there was the movement to replace various national languages, each supposedly bearers of national chauvinism and hatred, with a new international language. An international language that was to be the vehicle for peace and understanding amongst the people of the world, for which Polish doctor Jester Zamenhof designed the new language of hope, Esperanto. By 1900 there were Esperantist circles all over the world, though the whole Esperantist movement always had a vaguely socialistic tinge, whence during the Nazi period any knowledge of Esperanto could get you into a concentration camp. And science, of course, from its very onset had been international, gradually expanding from a Europe-wide to a worldwide community, as there was a consensus amongst both Hindu and Muslim reformers that were they to catch up with Europe, a scientific education was now necessary. Whence, for instance, Indian Muslim reformer Syed Ahmad Khan put up a private college for Muslims patterned on an Oxford College at Aligarh in 1867. There they were now to be taught the principles of modern science. Or again, there was the somewhat pan-Islamic journalist, as though he was Afghan born. He roamed through all Islamic countries, Jamal al-Din al-Afghani, who thought in the mid-19th century that while Islam had clearly been the global leader in science in the medieval period, Muslim scholars, due to these very past triumphs, had become too complacent and had neglected practical science, and that had allowed Europe to surge ahead in that field, while Muslim scholars had only concentrated on the law. Thus, in his view, were Muslims to progress, they were to turn to the study of practical science, rather than lingering in their complacency about the past triumphs in the age of the Caliphate or in their perfect faith. If they did so, he argued, and arguably predicted, they were going to be woefully unprepared for the future ahead. This view was then actually somewhat of a consensus amongst the educated middle classes, most of whom derived from the traditional merchant classes in the Ottoman Empire, in Egypt or in Iran. Yet the problem was basically that this group was also woefully small in all three, and that it contracted in size rather than that it grew as the 19th century went on. As the traditional business classes of all three were outcompeted by Western or Christian Armenian merchants in their own countries, and their goods outsold by foreign import, while the traditional upper classes, the clergy funded by tax-free endowments, and the landlords, both resented any tampering with Islam, and what little education there was for peasants and nomads was virtually monopolized by traditional Islam schools. The reason why Islam has had particular difficulties adapting to modern science is, in other words, perhaps not so much Islam as rather the social structure of the Islamic countries. While Hindu reformers faced the problem with scientific education not so much that the priesthood was opposed to it, as rather that the Raj was unwilling to fund it, as the focus of colonial education was on a training in the law that would allow Indians to fulfill lower administrative positions. Nonetheless, though to be sure the scientific community was still pretty much confined to Europe and to the Americas in the beginning of the 20th century, the first Japanese distinguished scientists working not surprisingly on earthquakes began to appear as well. The first mathematical society had been founded in Japan in 1877 to entirely reform Japanese mathematics. As it argued in Japan, the samurai had traditionally sought to strengthen not their mental but their physical constitution, whereas Confucian scholars had traditionally looked down on numbers as something for merchants. This is actually as good an explanation for the so-called Needham question, the question why China and Japan, who had been far in advance of European science in the Middle Ages, then fell behind, as any. For of course, modern science was practically identical to Greek mathematics, and Chinese mathematics was not only completely different from Greek mathematics, so that for education in physics you would have also to throw the entire Chinese mathematical system overboard, but it was linked to solving problems encountered in buying and selling goods as well, and that was something the traditional Confucian scholars always looked down upon. Now, globalization has broadly three and arguably four components, and in all four, people in the late 19th century could feel giant steps forwards had been made. First, there was the political component, the worldwide concert of states and the system of arrangements that unified them. And all those treaties and arrangements, so dear to modern international historians, were indeed the very scaffold on which the worldwide system of free trade was and is erected. For it was indeed difficult to establish worldwide production without a set of international arrangements on, for example, the delivery of mail that was in place by the 1830s, or again, to cheaply fetch goods from one country to another without a set of arrangements on a standard coach to be used in railway tracks, where famously most of the world used a 3.6-inch coach and Russia stuck to a 5-inch one. Again, worldwide trade and migration necessitated a worldwide system of time measurement, particularly critical for international passenger shipping, which from the 1830s onward went by timetables. For this, obviously against fierce resistance from the French, who wanted the Paris time introduced, all countries in 1884 fixed on the Greenwich meridian. Then there is a cultural and broadly linked to that a religious globalization, and third there is an economic globalization, and fourth arguably a scientific one. By the 1880s, physics was by and large already globalized, from which dates that most dreaded of modern institutions, the International Scientific Conference. By contrast, the first International Historical Conference was only held in Rome in 1905. For in 19th century historiography, there were two contrasting trends. On the one hand, modern source critical historiography, as it developed from the beginning of the 19th century onward, was entirely built around the nation-state, and its main purpose was to trace the origins of the nation-state as far back into remote history as possible. Yet on the other hand, the late 19th century not only witnessed a flurry of supposed world histories for the broader public, but even the father of the modern historian's profession, Leopold von Ranke, tried his hand at one, as he was already 80 years old. Although, admittedly, by simply scanning the table of contents for this work that runs via the Egyptians onto the Greeks, then onto the Romans, then onto the Carolinians, and then onto the German Empire, it is obvious this was far from any true world history. And commonly, the supposed world histories of that period started from the view of mankind's pilgrimage, as one such popular world history textbook used to be called in the Netherlands, in which civilization had started in the east, had then moved with the Romans to the Mediterranean, had moved northwards in the Middle Ages, and now resided somewhere in Hampstead, the Reef Coast or Laren. For despite the enormous accumulation of knowledge on the non-West in the 19th century, the mainstream of scholarship, both in history and in the social sciences, basked in a sense of Western superiority. The Orient could not teach anything useful to the West, and the West had everything to teach to the East. Since, as Tennyson wrote, quote, there would be enjoyment more than in the march of mind, in the steamship, in the railway, in the thoughts that shape mankind. Forward, forward let us range. Let the great world spin forever down the ringing grooves of change. Through the shadow of the globe we sweep into the younger day. Better 50 years of Europe than a cycle of Cathay. The modern world of the steamship and the railway was unmistakably European, so that, for example, in Leiden University in the beginning of the 20th century, Chinese was ranked amongst the dead languages, on a par with Sanskrit, Latin or Pali, as the last useful contributions the Chinese language had made to progress and civilization were located somewhere in the age of Confucius. And this was, of course, as Tennyson might have added, because the Chinese lacked the true Protestant faith, the only key to scientific progress. And many missionaries would fully have agreed with that view, as they commonly used the superiority of Western science as an argument for the superiority of the Christian God. In the missions in Yorubaland in the 80s of the 19th century, for example, missionaries might stage pyrotechnic performances or demonstrate electric machines to show that as the white man was far superior to the Yoruba in everything, his religion could not be inferior to theirs too. And in this modern age, the missions had any reason to be content on how, with the division of the world amongst the imperialist powers, there was an unstoppable advance of Western Christianity as well. Indeed, the general hope was that from this might ensue the growth of a world church with deep roots and vigorous expressions on every continent, so that missionary William Temple Gardner, in his review of the first worldwide gathering of the various Protestant denominations in Edinburgh in 1910, could orate, very much echoing Bryce, quote, humanity was awakening to self-consciousness. It became tenfold more urgent to say to humanity, ecce homo. The world was realizing it was a unity. Was that unity to be in the one Lord and the one faith? Were the gigantic forces now liberated all over the world merely to fight and clash their way to future settlement? Or was the inconceivable acridity of such a conflict to be modified and mitigated and humanized by Orient joining Occident in the faith of Christ? For indeed, one of the impacts of the globalization of culture in the late 19th century was the rise of a globalized Christianity, as Christianity spread beyond Europe, Siberia or South America to now encompass the South Seas that were largely converted by 1900. The earliest missionary work had started as early as 1795 in Tonga and Tahiti, and it had started in New Zealand in the 1830s. And to the missionaries' own amazement, by 1860 already 3/4 of all Maoris were converted, as well as to Hawaii. This was of course a special field for American missionaries who had been active there since the 20s, and they had by and large converted the population of Hawaii by the 60s. Christianity spread with limited success to China, another special field of American missionaries, and to the pagan parts of Indonesia, such as the Batak lands on Sumatra, which were converted to Protestantism by Dutch missionaries. Though Christianity made little or no progress in Java, that rather was becoming ever more Islamic in the 19th century. And it made some headway among the Montagnard population of Vietnam and the Karen and Shan population of Burma. All of this caused calls from Buddhist monks in Burma to unite and rally to the cause of a Buddhist faith that was now increasingly threatened by those Christian missionaries who termed the entire Burmese culture inferior, and against whom the Buddhist Sangam in turn raged, quote, "The diabolism known as Christianity has its paid professors in theological seminaries, where in incubation are hatched half-trained idiots who are sent to civilized people to disseminate those insane views that are merely meant for the enslaved beggar," such as was indeed the colonized population of Burma. And then again, to further pursue the Buddhists, as Anakiraka Dharmapala wrote in 1902, quote, "Buddhism is accused by the missionaries of atheism because it denies a creator. Yet science does not see a loving, all-seeing creator. With all the pestilence, the famines, the wars, the extinction of the helpless black races in Australia, the lynchings in the United States, the extinction of Indians in North America, all the unequal distribution of wealth in the world, all the annihilation of weaker races by brutal ones, no sober-minded Buddhist could ever believe the world is guided by an all-loving creator." Which is, aside from the merit or not of this argument, also a pretty good evocation of how globalization was experienced by those not living in a mansion in London. Yet the Christian missionaries were ultimately to make their greatest progress in Africa. Argued, and indeed predicted, one of the towering intellectual figures of the 19th century, Edmund Wilmot Blyden, professor of theology in the first European-style university in Africa, Fura Bay College, Freetown, Sierra Leone, quote, Africa may yet prove to be the spiritual conservatory of the faith. Just as in past times, Egypt proved the stronghold of Christianity after Jerusalem fell, and just as the noblest and greatest of the fathers of the Christian Church came out of Egypt, so it may be that when the civilized nations, in consequence of their wonderful material development, have had their spiritual perceptions darkened and their spiritual susceptibilities blunted through the agency of a capturing and all-absorbing materialism, they may have to resort to Africa to recover some of the simple elements of the faith. Anthropologist Robin Horton has in a famous discussion explained the rapid growth of conversions to both Islam and Christianity in Africa by a suddenly enhanced scale of life, by flight or forced labor. Traditional African religions were, as I said, communal religions, primarily expressed in the doings of the community of the believers rather than in any clearly defined dogmatic tenets, and they focused on lesser spirits linked to the microcosm, spirits of the household or of the village, whereas ideas of the macrocosm, such as that of a creator god linked to states and towns, were very poorly developed. As people after the colonization became more involved with life beyond their communities, the supreme being of the macrocosm tended to substitute for those of the microcosm, allowing to convert or to adapt to book religions with some facility. African religions also did not formulate their beliefs in sets of core beliefs or dogmas that were taught from any book. They were rather caught from family and neighbors. Traditional African religion was thus essentially local, tied to this local shrine, this village festival, this village taboo. And the man who left his village was almost bound to cease to practice his inherited religion. Although some African religions, such as Yoruba Olodumare, spread far and wide, all over Nigeria, into Benin, and even to Brazil and Cuba, Islam and Christianity still seem to offer the best answer to deal with this sudden enhancement of scale, as they offered access to a much wider overarching set of beliefs, whether the Christian world or the Dar al-Islam. Islam too. For Islam was from roughly 1790 on, and particularly with the foundation of the Caliphate of Sokoto in 1809, rapidly expanding throughout the African continent. Blyden, who observed it all from close up in northern Liberia, where the population was converted to Islam in the 1860s, ventured in his book Christianity, Islam and the Negro Race from 1884 on the explanation that converts to Christianity had become slavishly dependent on Europeans, but Islamic ones had loosened from further contacts with Arabia, built powerful independent military and political institutions, as well as vigorous separate literatures in Hausa and Swahili, whilst the Christians merely copied the literatures or the latest hints of Canterbury or Rome. Islam had become a true African religion, Blyden marked. Christianity was merely a foreign transplant that would wither unless emancipating itself from its European roots. As Blyden was writing, however, the age of the greatest expansion of Islam in Africa was coming to a close, as with the spread of long-distance networks of trade of Arab merchants into the hinterland of East Africa and beyond. If the Belgians would not have come there, the Eastern Congo might likely have featured the rise of Islamic sultanates. And even then, the longest and bitterest resistance against Leopold II's force publique came from Islamic jihadist warriors. Or there was the Muslim Brotherhood of the Sanusi, originally a missionary congregation preaching amongst the Bedouin of the Sahara, who started a jihad against the French, but particularly against the Italians from 1900 onwards. They were part preachers, part armed caravan guards, part rulers over oases, and occasionally plunderers of caravans as well. Then there were the missionary jihadist states, such as that of the Dioula or Mandingo in West Africa, with which the French colonial army waged its longest and bitterest war, and England's foe, the Mahdist state. The borders of this great expansion of Islam have more or less remained those of the present. Yet Islam still spread over new areas such as South Africa, but above all as groups who had remained pagan during the previous great expansion of Islam were converted to it. Thus, ironically, under very Catholic Portuguese rule, most of the north of Mozambique was converted to Islam, whilst it was also making rapid headway in Tanganyika, as Islamic texts were imported there in bulk from Cairo or Batavia. Yet Orthodox Islam's dilemma was that it was wholly a religion of the macrocosm, providing few humanly satisfactory remedies for evil, and many complained Orthodox Islam was a harsh religion, offering limited scope for religious experimentation as Africans sought to adapt to the macrocosm, unlike Christianity increasingly did. Furthermore, Christianity was modern, and modernity above all seemed to offer solace to all the problems Africans were struggling with. Yet, on the brink of it, considering globalized religion, what is most striking is that it was a, to use a folk word, asymmetrical relationship. While Christianity was making many converts in Vietnam, Taoism or Confucianism made few or no converts in Europe. The first visible impact of Eastern religion came with the folk of esoteric cults in the late 19th century, such as Theosophy, founded by Russian spirit medium Yelena Blavatsky, who traveled to India in the 80s and had close ties with the people of the Hindu reform movement Arya Samaj there, to the general outrage of colonial society, for whom a white lady should never mingle with a darky. Blavatsky believed that humanity derived from the root races, each of which divided into 7 sub-races. The first root race was created from pure spirit. It lived on a continent known as the imperishable sacred land. The second root race, known as the Hyperboreans, but also formed from pure spirit, and lived on the North Pole. The third lived on the continent of Lemuria. During the 4th round of the Earth, higher beings had descended to the planet, the beginning of human physical bodies developing and sexes separating. At that point, the fourth root race appeared, who lived on the continent of Atlantis. They had physical bodies but psychic powers as well and advanced technologies, and they had built such monuments as Stonehenge. Yet the Atlanteans were decadent and abused their power, so Atlantis sunk into the sea. However, some Atlanteans escaped and created new societies in Egypt and in the Americas. The fifth root race to emerge from them were the Aryans, and they were found across the world at the time she was writing. Now, the influence and impact of Blavatsky has clearly been monumental, ranging from Mahatma Gandhi, for whom his encounter with Blavatsky when he studied in London was a life-changing event, via, indeed bien étonné de se trouver ensemble, SS leader Heinrich Himmler, by trading a chicken farmer, so he was certainly no intellectual heavyweight, who took over much of Blavatsky's cosmogony for his own SS cult that was in future to replace Christianity, and so on, via Erich van Däniken, who equated her higher beings with cosmonauts, to all the hundreds of thousands of modern Atlantis adepts, and there are still people around who believe in Lemuria as well. Yet, all these esoteric cults were obviously completely outside of the mainstream of organized Western religion. Theosophy had perhaps 7,000 adherents in Europe and the USA. And so as well, the impact of cultural globalization was quite lopsided. Whereas the West had in the 19th century a near existential impact on the East, as Wei Tan bewailed, any conceivable Eastern impact on the West arguably decreased in the course of the 19th century. During the age of high romanticism in the early 19th century, under the impression of what may be called the Newtonian transformation of linguistics, namely the discovery that ancient Greek and Sanskrit were linguistically very close, so that Greece and India clearly shared a primeval common culture. India was still widely seen as the original source of human wisdom, and the work of such early Indologists as Friedrich Schlegel had a considerable impact on the German Romantic movement. But by 1840 this began to give way to an ever more patronizing attitude. If India had ever had anything to teach to the West, those days were long past, so that Oxford professor of Indology, Max Müller, could bewail in 1883, quote, "Why is it that a study of Latin and Greek should incite enthusiasm and command general respect, while a study of Sanskrit and ancient Indian art, poetry or laws is looked upon at best as curious, and by most as useless, tedious and absurd? A student of Sanskrit is considered a bore," as he clearly still is. Looking at your average philosophy curriculum, in which every phrase of Plato is considered over and over again, but Indian philosophy is completely ignored. In other words, whilst a vast amount of energy and even funds were poured into the scientific study of ancient Indian writings in the 19th century, this comprehensive body of knowledge was virtually ignored by mainstream Western philosophy, sociology, theology, historiography, let alone political economy, all of whom, rather, by 1835, reasoned with Macaulay that, quote, "I have no knowledge of either Sanskrit or Arabic." but I have done what I could to form a correct estimate of their value. I have read translations of the most celebrated Arabic and Sanskrit works. I have conversed, both here and at home, with men distinguished by their proficiency in the Eastern tongues. I am quite ready to take the Oriental learning at the valuation of the Orientalists themselves, and I have never found one among them who could deny that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia, let alone with the literature of China, of course. While the study of Africa was tucked away in yet another obscure scientific corner evolving in the 19th century, namely social anthropology. Social anthropology was then conceived as the study of man in his most primitive state. The anthropologist or the ethnographer studied societies that had stood still since the Ice Ages, unlike Western societies that had always been evolving, and thus they belonged to the realm of history, while in Africa everything had been stagnant, and this despite the fact that the ethnologist had by 1900 gathered a substantial amount of data on the glorious medieval history of West Africa. So that in a way, what is most typical is perhaps not the extent to which the study of the Orient or Africa served as handmaiden of the colonial project, as Edward Said argued in his famous book Orientalism, as rather the extent to which the colonial project ignored Oriental or African cultures. Some cultural or folkloristic data were all nice and well, but the colonial acquisition of knowledge was guided by practical considerations. It needed figures on population, on productivity of the soil, or field maps to assess taxes. And beyond that daily routine, as Barbara Wingfield Stratford wrote about the English community in India in 1922, quote, "When one thinks of the unlimited possibilities life in India gives to those whose lot is cast there, the opportunities for artistic appreciation of some of nature and man's most marvelous efforts, for the study of one of the world's oldest civilizations, one is lost in astonishment at the apathy and unimaginativeness of the average Anglo-Indian, his insularity and contempt for all things Indian." End quote. So that it is surely no coincidence too that the study of ancient India was more or less monopolized by German universities in the 19th century. Though I ought to add immediately that the British did establish an archaeological survey of India already in 1853, or that Viceroy Curzon of Kettlestone, in many ways the very epitome of British imperialism, actually personally exerted himself for the restoration of India's ancient monuments. Thus too, the Egyptian Museum in Cairo was established during the British Protectorate, and that was very much in order to stop the relentless looting of ancient Egyptian artifacts that had taken place previously. The father of modern Egyptology, Giovanni Belzoni, a very bizarre figure indeed, who had started off as a monk, then became a strong man in a local circus, where he earned his nickname the Great Belzoni, and ended as an Egyptian pasha, was little more than a dignified art thief. And this was but one instance of the relentless looting of cultural artifacts from both Asia and Africa that accompanied the victorious onward march of Europe's colonial armies in the 19th century. Thus, for example, Beijing was not merely looted once, but twice. during the Second Opium War in 1860 and the Boxer War in 1900. Where the European soldiers stole money, it was remarked at the time, Indian ones stole diamonds, but their officers cunningly stole as many antique artifacts as they could grab, so as to profitably sell them on to European or North American museums later on. The Oriental collections of the Louvre, of New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art, or indeed of Amsterdam's Rijksmuseum, for the Dutch also sent their own contingent to the Boxer War, owe a lot more to the looting of Beijing than they were or are willing to acknowledge. Yet neither all that relentless work of the Orientalists to publish ancient Oriental texts, where they admittedly focused on publishing religious texts, thus also creating the idea that India was a deeply spiritual civilization as distinct from that individualist and materialist West, an idea that Indian intellectuals then eagerly seized upon, nor the ever-increasing stocks of Asian or African art available in European museums, or more commonly for sale on the local flea market, had much impact on either European literature, as Marx hoped, nor on European arts. The only exception is the art from the one country that was ironically not colonized by the West, namely Japan, where the woodblock cuttings of Hokusai became a constant inspiration to such impressionist painters as Monet or Gauguin, and Indonesian art had some influence on the Dutch Art Nouveau movement of the late 19th century. Yet the impact of other non-European art on European art was still remarkably slight. In the mid-19th century, to be sure, French painters, to find exotic motifs for their paintings, often traveled the short distance across the Mediterranean to Algeria. Yet with all that, Arab high culture of painting had little or no discernible impact on either their style of painting or their topics. They commonly painted the Arabs either as rough, unspoiled, noble savages, or would focus on all the forbidden delights of the harem. Nor perhaps could it be otherwise, for as one such painter, Eugène Fromentin, wondered in 1836, quote, "Do we, the French and the Arabs, really understand each other? I don't think we ever will. There are impossible composites in politics as there are in chemistry, and legally ordained close contacts will not smother centuries of hatred. There is peace now, but how long will that last? These are the big questions wherever the West shares territory with the East, wherever the North as well accidentally faces its ancient rival, the South." This atmosphere of mutual distrust was partly inherent to the situation in Algeria, that always retained the atmosphere of an armed lager of 100,000 pieds noirs guarded by the Foreign Legion against a potential uprising of 2 million Arabs. The first Arab revolt, after France took Algiers in 1830, was smothered in streams of blood in the 1850s, and the second one equally bloodily repressed in 1871, and everybody was always afraid another uprising might follow. Yet one might also wonder whether anyone has ever managed to satisfactorily answer these questions of Fromentin. For in the Arab countries, a European civilization, and surely a French civilization, that was and is completely sure of its own superiority ran smack into another one that was equally convinced of its superiority. Admittedly, eventually, but only in the late 19th century, a few hundred Algerian Arabs managed to absolve a French education and managed to imitate the French lifestyle sufficiently to qualify as what the French called évolués, whom in their way of talking or in the business suits they wore were indistinguishable from any inhabitant of southern France. And the so-called Bureau Arabe, under close supervision of the colonial government to be sure, managed a few Quran schools and named some government-approved alim. Yet the colonial government offered only minuscule funds to education for Arabs. 85% of its education budget went to the settlers, and the whole idea of Islam being managed by infidels remained repugnant to both most ulama and the broad community of believers. So the masses of poor peasants remained as opposed to the French and as deeply attached to Islam and to their ulama as before. And although the French state constantly stressed it was neutral in religion, in effect Algeria splintered into one society for Christians, where if you but stayed in the French part of Oran or Algiers, you could think you were in Marseille, and another part, where if you ventured in the Arab part of town, which of course any pied noir avoided as the bad neighborhood, you were suddenly in Africa, a sense that is well evoked in Bernardo Bertolucci's admittedly somewhat kitschy movie The Sheltering Sky, where in the part playing in the Christian neighborhood of Algiers, you could just as well be in France. And then the further the protagonist penetrates beyond that and into the interior, the more alien the place becomes. Yet these two places, the colonizers and the colonized place, were never equal. Rather, as François Fanon classically put it, quote, "The settler's town is a strongly built town, all made of stone and steel. It is a brightly lit town. The streets are covered with asphalt, and the garbage cans swallow all the leavings. The settler's town is a well-fed town, an easy-going town. Its belly is always full of good things. The settler's town is a town of white people, of foreigners. The town belonging to the colonized people is a place of ill fame, peopled by men of evil repute. They are born there. It matters little where or how. They die there. It matters not where nor how. It is a world without spaciousness. Men live there on top of each other, and their huts are built on top of the other. The native town is a hungry town, starved of bread, of meat, of shoes, of coal, of light. It is the town of niggers and dirty Arabs. The look that the native turns on the settler's town is a look of lust, a look of envy. It expresses his dreams of possession, all manner of possession, to sit at the settler's table, to sleep in the settler's bed, with his wife if possible. The colonized man is an envious man, and this the settler knows very well. When their glances meet, he ascertains bitterly, always on the defensive, they want to take our place. It is true, for there is no native who does not dream at least once a day of setting himself up in the settler's place." End quote. And all this may actually well be extended to the world order of 1900 as well. It was a fundamentally skewed world. where the European elites inhabited the European part of this new global village, all made of stone and steel, brightly lit, the streets covered with asphalt, and where the garbage cans swallowed all the leavings, while the natives of the poor part of the global village lived without spaciousness, lived on top of each other, and their huts built on top of each other. And that was actually typical of the economics of the first globalization as well. For those well-heeled inhabitant of London, who was going from some recreational cycling, did not have to bother how the rubber for his bicycle tire was gathered in Equatoria, or how the coca he might sip was gathered in the forests of the Ivory Coast. The same well-heeled inhabitant would, admittedly, occasionally appease any guilty feeling by donating a few pennies to the Anti-Slavery Association, an association led by such celebrities of the time as Arthur Conan Doyle, the father of Sherlock Holmes, and that campaigned against the forced labor Belgium used in the Congo and that the Portuguese used on the island of São Tomé. This was actually the first case of an international campaign for human rights led by a non-governmental organization. But of course, the Anti-Slavery Association did not campaign against the even more dreadful conditions in the South African mines or against the removal of the Kenya Kikuyu from their land to donate it to white settlers. Other nations might violate human rights, but never the British. Dr. Colin Leys, appalled by those forced removals and the awful conditions in the so-called native reserves in Kenya in the 20s of the 20th century, tried to raise awareness in Britain and to start a campaign against the forced removal of the Kikuyu. Yet he found that even in the left wing of the Labour Party nobody was interested at all, since the general view was that the British were humane colonizers and could do no wrong. If only the Kikuyu had lived in the Congo or Mozambique. And all this though Leys warned that if these expropriations went on, the British would inevitably have a bloody war between the settlers and the Kikuyu on their hand. Yet nobody listened to him. Of course, on the European continent, and in Germany in particular, the opposite applied. There the first international campaign for human rights rather focused on all the horrors of the British internment or reconcentration camps of the war. Now, this economic internationalization was a system of free trade in goods and capital, just like the second globalization after 1980. But it was a system too, unlike the second globalization, where things, good or capital, may freely pass boundaries, but people have as much as possible to remain locked within them, where the ordinary man, with some adventurous tastes and the desire to get it all, is beyond measure better off than were his forefathers 1, 2 or 3 centuries back. He can travel all around the world, can dwell in any country he wishes, and can explore strange new regions. American President Theodore Roosevelt exulted in 1906, though this did admittedly only apply to the Chinese and Indian majority of mankind with many restrictions, as we shall see later on. The figures of the growth of global markets during the order of trade prevailing in the last decades of the 19th century are impressive. World trade grew from approximately $7.3 billion in 1820 to 25 in 1860 to 236 in 1910 to 334 in 1929. In many ways, then, the world was economically much more linked and unified in 1913 than it is today. From 1870 to 1914, for example, Argentina imported capital equivalent to 18.7% of its national income. Australia 8.3%. In the 90s of the 20th century, that were a meager 2.2 and 4%. Similarly, in 1913, Britain exported in capital 7% of its national income, a percentage no economy before or since has even approached. Then again, far more people worked in globalized industries in 1900 than is the case nowadays. The processing of South African diamonds was, for instance, one of the main branches of employ in Amsterdam, and actually my native, as listeners may note from my accent, turf, the so-called Diamond Neighborhood in Amsterdam East, was erected in the 1920s as upscale council housing for workers employed in that industry. Nowadays, the diamond industry employs a few hundred people, half of them catering for tourists. Again, thousands were employed in the harbour of Amsterdam, where coca beans from the Ivory Coast or the Gold Coast were unloaded to be processed in the Verkade factory in Zaandam, on which the employ in the whole north of Holland then depended. The latter factory is nowadays a museum, and Verkade employs a few hundred people, whereas the Amsterdam harbour, which was once good for more than 30,000 jobs, now barely employs 4,000. This is a story that could be repeated for all industrialized countries, to which must be added the hundreds of thousands of people then employed in shipping. Sailors were in industrialized countries then a major part of the workforce, while the big choice in life for somebody from the working classes, as you had absolved primary school, as I indeed still recall, was then to either go work in a factory or go to sea. Shipping nowadays employs a few thousand people in industrialized countries. And finally, a much larger percentage of gross national product was derived from trade than is common nowadays. For Britain, it was 30% in 1913. Nowadays, the European Union's average hovers around 20%. In this world order, capital, just like art, had no fatherland. About $18 billion had by 1914 been invested in enterprises in which investors not native to or not resident in a country controlled a majority of the equity interests. In 1820, Britain exported some 100 million sterling in capital. In 1870, 700 million and 1.2 billion sterling in 1913. And of that, by far the largest sum, probably 40%, went to the USA. In other words, the American industrialization was by and large funded by the British, so that with that they also built up their own bitterest industrial rival, one that, furthermore, continued protecting its industry with draconic tariffs, but the exports of which to Britain were virtually tariff-free. But then, as I said, on the one hand, the British had critically come to depend on American grain, so that if they had imposed tariffs on American grain, they would merely have cut their own arteries. And on the other hand, the USA was of course the one country that the Royal Navy could not blockade to enforce demands. It slashes its tariffs and import barriers. as it did on at least 45 occasions with other countries. Of that British investment, a further 80% was concentrated in railway stocks. Or, in other words again, the late 19th century's railway boom, in which the USA laid out a stupendous 120,000 miles of railroad in a mere 30 years. By contrast, India had 46,000 miles of railroad in 1913, China less than 10,000 and Russia 40,000, was by and large British financed. And in turn, of course, the vast amounts of steel required for all those railroads energized that American steel industry that was the tug for the industrialization of the USA. The late 19th century also featured two new developments in capitalism that were both pioneered in the newly industrializing countries, Germany and the USA. First, there was the rise of the corporation, all those brand names with incorporated behind it, Société Anonyme, Besloten Vennootschap, Actionsgemeinschaft, and so on, that were financed by joint stock. This was a form of organization that was originally pioneered as an extension of state power to finance publicly useful projects. But by 1900 it had rather become a sanctuary of private capital that was sheltered from state interference with the judicial fiction created by the Supreme Court of the United States in the 1870s that corporations are persons and are therefore liable under the 14th Amendment to legal protection. Very simply put, in the early 19th century's form of capitalism, many capitalists owned very many small units that were either financed by themselves or by banks. In the late 19th century, a very few capitalists owned a very few big units that were financed by stock noted on Wall Street or on the Frankfurt Exchange. In the USA, the corporations originated from the railroad investment companies, but by the 1890s they began to move into manufacturing as well, where the great milestone was the foundation of United Steel in 1901, the largest company of the world, accounting for 30% of the world's entire output of steel. While in Germany, the formation of large corporations was essentially pushed by the banks, since banks there were linked to specific branches of industry and fostered concentration, both as large corporations produced more efficiently and as their fortunes were less dependent on the personal fortunes or misfortunes of their owners. By 1900, a full third of Germany's entire labor force was employed by giant corporations, such as in Steel Group, which alone employed 26,000 people, in chemicals, Höchst, or Badische Anilin- und Soda-Fabrik, or in electronics the Allgemeine Elektricitätsgesellschaft. By contrast, even very large British corporations, such as Cadbury or Rowntree or Lipton, tended still to be family firms. And second, the period also featured the rise of those industrial and banking behemoths, the transnational companies, which now control some 70% of the entire world trade, and it is estimated 30% of world trade is made up of goods transferred within the same transnational company. Multinational companies had their main office in the metropolis, but production and redistribution were done by subsidiaries or branches in other countries, both because of the size of their internal market, and as they could spend most money on research and development. The largest of these corporations were American: John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil, United Steel, and United Fruit Company. Quote, Cuando sonó la trompeta, estuvo todo preparando en la tierra, y Jehová repartió el mundo a Coca-Cola, a Anaconda, Ford Motors y otras entidades. La compañía frutera Inco se reservó lo más lujoso, la costa central de mi tierra, la dulce cintura de América. Or, when Jehovah's trumpet sounds and the world is ready, Jesus will allot the world to Coca-Cola, Anaconda, to Ford Motors and other corporations, and United Fruit Inc. gets the best, all the coast of my beautiful country, that slender waste of America, to wit, Guatemala, Costa Rica or El Salvador. Thus Chilean Nobel Prize winner Pablo Neruda. Yet there were European giants too, whose history is closely linked to that of colonialism and who commonly both advocated and supported an activist colonial and foreign policy, such as Belgian Société Générale and Union Minière, or the Anglo-English Unilever and Shell. The latter originated from a fusion between the Marques Samuel Transport Company, that originally had traded in boxes made of shells, hence its name, that then began drilling for oil in Sarawak, and Dutch Batavian Petrol, founded in the 80s, that drilled for oil in Banjarmasin in Borneo in 1907, thus creating the first binational company, headquartered both in the Netherlands and in Britain. Thus too, there were the Banque de l'Industrie, nowadays called Banque Française Commerciale. There were Pneus Michelin, that owned rubber plantations in Gabon and in Indochina, or there was the Portuguese Banco Ultramarino Group, which operated in all Portuguese colonies. Or there was finally the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, nowadays British Petrol, founded by mine owner William Knox de Arcy, who in 1900 obtained a concession to drill for oil in Persia, where 84% of the revenues were to go to the Arcy and 16% to the government of Iran, a concession that has haunted Persia ever since. Though the true behemoths amongst these new transnational concerns were domiciled in the metropolis, they had their kin and kind in the colonies as well. Thus, the mining giant Broken Hill Property from Australia, Canadian Aluminium Corporation of the Americas, or Anaconda of Neruda's hymn, or the Beers Diamonds from South Africa. Yet, while a few had good forebodings about that internationalization, most socialist theoreticians prophesied that this new phase of imperialism, one that they called financial capitalism, and that was characterized by monopolies and the predominance of banking over industrial capital, would not only lead to deeper and more prolonged crisis, but to increasing competition and thus ultimately to war amongst the capitalist states as well. For, argued the teacher at the Social Democratic Party School Rudolf Hilferding in 1910, quote, finance capital does not want freedom, it wants domination. It has no regard for the independence of the individual capitalist, but demands his allegiance. It detests the hierarchy of competition and wants organization. But in order to achieve those ends, it needs the state that can guarantee its domestic market through a protective tariff policy and facilitate the conquest of foreign markets. It needs a strong state that will ensure respect for the interest of finance capital abroad and use its political power to extort advantageous supply contracts and trade agreements from smaller states. It wants a state that can intervene in every corner of the globe and transform the whole world into a sphere of investment for its own finance capital. Liberalism opposed international power politics. It only wanted to secure its own rule against the old forces of aristocracy and bureaucracy by granting them the least possible access to state power. But finance capital demands unlimited power politics. The demand for an expansionist policy revolutionizes the whole worldview of the bourgeoisie, a bourgeoisie that ceases to be peace-loving and humanitarian. The old free traders believed in free trade, not only as the best economic policy, but as the beginning of an era of peace. Finance capital has no faith in the harmony of capitalist interests. It knows well that competition is becoming increasingly a political power struggle. The ideal of peace has lost its luster, and in place of the idea of humanity, there emerges a glorification of the greatness and power of the state. The ideal now is to secure for one's own nation the domination of the world. Capital becomes the conqueror of the world, and with every new country that it conquers, there are new frontiers to be crossed. All this has an economic basis, but it is justified ideologically by an extraordinary perversion of the national idea, one which no longer recognizes the right of every nation to political self-determination and independence, and ceases to express with regards to nations the democratic creed of the equality of all members of the human race. Instead, the economic privileges of monopoly are mirrored in the privileged position claimed for one's own nation, which is represented as a chosen nation. Thus there emerges in racist ideology, cloaked in the garb of natural science, a justification for finance capital's lust for power, which is thus shown to have the necessity of its natural phenomenon. And Hilverding himself, indeed, was ultimately to experience what he had predicted. He disappeared in a Gestapo prison in Paris in 1941, and his wife Margaretha died in Theresienstadt concentration camp in 1942.